Jonathan Blake here. If you appreciate clear, no-nonsense narration that cuts through the noise, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown. And while you're listening, drop a comment with your take on what you think these strikes are really meant to achieve. Because the story unfolding right now isn't only about explosions and intercepted drones. It's about psychology, pressure, messaging, and the slow collapse of the idea that one side can keep war somewhere else. Ukraine just unleashed something massive toward Moscow. One of the largest drone barrages reported this year has played out over multiple days, and Russia is scrambling to keep the situation under control, both in the skies and in the minds of its people. Oil is burning in the south. Airports are freezing up around the capital. Mobile internet is going dark in major cities, and whether the Kremlin admits it or not, the center of Russia's comfort zone is being tested. The Moscow Times laid out the basic framework of what happened across the weekend into March 16th, a sustained multi-day wave of drones aimed at the Russian capital region continuing into the 16th, according to Moscow's mayor, Sergei Sobyanin. The headline detail is the scale. Not a single isolated strike, not a symbolic buzz of a few aircraft, but a barrage designed to force a response, to exhaust attention, and to put Moscow residents into a new routine, one where air defenses, alerts, disruptions, and uncertainty become normal. And of course, the official Russian response follows a pattern we've seen again and again. The mayor says air defenses destroyed everything. Russia's messaging almost always tries to frame these moments as total control. Nothing got through, nothing mattered, everything was handled. But scale changes the meaning. When the sky is busy for long enough, we shot them down, stops being the reassurance they want it to be, because people still hear the blasts, still see the disruptions, still feel the consequences in their daily lives. Sobyanin claimed that over the past 2 days, air defense forces destroyed roughly 250 UAVs on approaches to Moscow and at the second line of approach. Whether every number is accurate or not, the point is what that number communicates. 250 is not a nuisance. 250 is a statement. It tells Moscow residents that distance is no longer a guarantee of safety, and it tells the Kremlin that protecting the capital requires constant effort, constant resources, and constant narrative management. This isn't the first time drones have been launched toward Moscow. There was a similar attempt roughly a year earlier, in March 2025, when Russia's defense ministry said 91 drones were shot down in and around the capital, and that attack was linked to deaths. In this latest wave, there were no casualties reported at the time these claims circulated, though in a situation this fluid, the truth often arrives late, filtered, and contested. What did arrive quickly were eyewitness reports, blasts in multiple locations, and an expanding ring of disruption around the capital. Reports described explosions and air defense activity across areas like the Troitsky Administrative District and in places including Podolsk, Domodedovo, Dubna, Mojaisk, Istra, Solnekhnegorsk, and Naro-Fominsk. The exact mix of impacts, debris, interceptions, and damage is hard to verify in real time, especially under information pressure, but the spread of place names matters. It suggests wide area activity rather than a single point incident, exactly the kind of event that breaks the illusion of neat control. Then come the airport closures, one of the most underappreciated indicators of how serious an air situation is. Russia's aviation authority, Rosaviatsia, imposed restrictions across several major airports serving the Moscow region. Vnukovo, Domodedovo, Zhukovsky, and Sheremetyevo were hit by delays and cancellations. Vnukovo reportedly recovered first, while others continued operating only in coordination with relevant authorities. That phrasing is bureaucratic, but what it means on the ground is messy. Diverted aircraft, frozen gates, backed up passengers, disrupted schedules, and a cascade of logistical problems that can take days to unwind. And here's why that matters beyond convenience. Airport shutdowns do something propaganda struggles to undo. A statement can be denied, a rumor can be mocked, a video can be blocked. But a canceled flight is a fact inside your day. It's friction you can't talk your way out of. It strands travelers, scrambles work plans, hits families, and quietly spreads one message from person to person. Something is happening, and it is close enough to force safety restrictions. Every canceled or delayed flight also carries an economic tail. Refunds mean money that doesn't flow into the system the same way, and disruptions mean costs that pile up. Staffing, rebooking, delays, fuel adjustments, missed connections, compensation, and reputational damage. There's a historical parallel mentioned in reporting from July 2025, when a mass drone event across 10 Russian cities led to thousands of delays, hundreds of cancellations, and tens of thousands of refunds. If you want to apply pressure without capturing territory, you target rhythms, movement, commerce, routine, and you force a state to spend political capital explaining why normal life keeps failing. Now layer on another wrinkle. What kind of drones were used? Russian military-linked Telegram channels claimed Ukraine used FP-1 drones, launched in waves of 8 to 10 at a time. The reported specs are blunt. Payload capacity up to 60 kilograms of explosives and a range around 2,400 kilometers, putting Moscow within reach. The FP-1 reportedly surfaced publicly in 2025, and multiple outlets described it as part of a shift toward cheaper, more scalable long-range pressure, exactly what a swarm strategy needs. Cheap is not a side detail. Cheap changes the math. A low-cost platform that can be produced quickly and launched in large quantities forces defenders into a bad bargain. Spend expensive interceptors on inexpensive drones, keep radars and crews running for long periods, accept fatigue and errors, and still face the chance that a few units slip through. Even if defenses claim perfect performance, the defender is still forced to prove it repeatedly under stress, while the attacker can keep turning the crank. And in a swarm dynamic, success isn't only measured in craters. Success can be measured in airport restrictions, internet blackouts, political discomfort, and the creeping realization among civilians that the war has moved from an abstract televised narrative to something that interferes with life in the capital. That brings us to the information clampdowns, because this is where the psychological and political layers become obvious. The Moscow Times reported that around the same weekend as the barrage, many people across Russia lost access to Telegram without VPNs. There were also claims that a more comprehensive crackdown could come later, but the timing of outages during an intense drone period sends a message of its own. Authorities don't usually cut off communication tools when everything is calm. They restrict visibility when they fear what people might see and share. The Kyiv Post also reported what it called a digital blackout over Moscow and St. Petersburg, cutting millions from mobile internet services. Explanations vary, everything from security concerns to internal politics, but functionally the result is the same. Fewer civilian uploads, fewer real-time eyewitness accounts, fewer uncontrolled narratives. When the sky is busy, the state wants one story, one tone, one set of numbers, and one emotional outcome. Calm obedience. The harder it works to force that calm, the more it reveals its anxiety. But while Moscow's information space tightens, another region offers something Moscow can't fully hide: visible, sustained fires. Far from the capital, Russia's oil infrastructure has been taking hits that are difficult to explain away, especially when flames climb high enough to dominate the horizon. And this is where Krasnodar Krai enters the picture, about 1,300 kilometers south of Moscow and strategically positioned near the Black Sea. That location matters because it sits along logistics routes and contains oil depots and transit points that feed military operations in occupied territory. In other words, it's not only an economic target, it's a war-sustaining target. In the early hours of March 16th, reports described a drone strike hitting an oil depot in the Lubinsk industrial zone. Local emergency services said the drone attack caused a fire and that there were no casualties in preliminary information. And then, as often happens, unofficial videos and photos spread showing fire intensity that's hard to square with the "everything was intercepted" line. Multiple posts described growing flames at the facility as the night progressed. Official explanations leaned on the familiar template. Air defenses worked, debris fell, and that debris somehow caused catastrophic ignition. The problem is that this story repeats so often it begins to collapse under its own weight. If debris consistently triggers massive infernos at high-value sites, the implication is either that defenses are failing more than admitted, or that the infrastructure is so vulnerable that even partial impacts can cause outsized damage. Either way, it's not reassuring. The Kyiv Independent added that Krasnodar Krai had been a frequent target over the previous week. On March 15th, reports described a strike on the Tikhoretsk oil pumping station, one of the region's key transit points, with imagery circulating of the facility burning. That strike reportedly followed a March 12th attack on the same facility, and around the same time, there were reports of a strike on the Afipsky oil refinery. Taken together, this paints a strategy, not a coincidence. Repeated pressure on nodes that move fuel, store fuel, and refine fuel. Ukraine's logic is straightforward. Reduce the flow, raise the cost, force rerouting, create shortages, slow mechanized capability. And even when fuel exists, make it harder, riskier, and more expensive to deliver it where it needs to go. Krasnodar Krai, as described in reporting, functions as a logistics hub that supports Russian forces, with depots acting like gas stations, feeding operations tied to southern Ukraine. When you burn the stations, you don't just lose inventory, you lose time, routing simplicity, and confidence. You force a war machine to spend effort protecting infrastructure instead of projecting power. Mechanized assaults depend on steady fuel. Without it, armor becomes static. Logistics convoys become higher priority targets. Artillery repositioning becomes harder. Mobile air defense becomes less mobile. And if a defender is forced to cluster assets for protection, clustering creates its own vulnerability, especially under drones that can search, harass, and strike repeatedly. There's also a revenue dimension. Oil is one of Russia's most valuable economic levers. Burning oil can't be exported. Damaged terminals and refineries reduce capacity. And even temporary disruptions can force pricing adjustments, insurance recalculations, and delays that ripple through supply chains. Some reporting also referenced global oil price movement tied to broader regional conflicts, suggesting Russia could benefit short-term from price spikes. Yet that only makes strikes on infrastructure more strategically timed, because every barrel that can't move is a missed opportunity to cash in. Now bring the story back to Moscow, because the capital strikes and the southern oil fires serve different immediate purposes while pushing toward the same end state, weakening the war machine and undermining the narrative that the Kremlin can contain consequences. Moscow's value is psychological and political. It's the city the leadership most wants to keep insulated. It's the center of administration, prestige, media control, and national symbolism. Even small disruptions there carry disproportionate political weight. When airports close around Moscow, it's not just an inconvenience. It's a signal that the conflict has a reach that propaganda cannot fully shrink. And here's the crucial idea. Even if every single drone were intercepted, the pressure still works. The defender must commit resources. The state must explain disruptions. The residents must absorb the fact that the capital is being tested. The public must reconcile the tension between "we are strong" messaging and the reality of repeated air alerts, flight restrictions, and connectivity disruptions. This is why long-range strikes matter as a security guarantee for Ukraine. A country facing invasion needs leverage beyond the front line. The ability to reach deep into the aggressor's territory complicates planning, pulls air defense assets away from the front, and imposes uncertainty where leaders least want it. It also tells allies and opponents alike that Ukraine retains initiative, innovation, and the will to escalate in response to continued aggression. And if the FP-1 drones are indeed being produced at high rates, as some reports claim, figures like around 100 per day and a cost per unit in the tens of thousands, then the pressure campaign can be sustained. The goal doesn't have to be immediate devastation. The goal can be persistence, a rhythm of strikes that forces Russia to live with the consequences of the war it launched. Now consider what Moscow's leadership is forced to contemplate. Even under Russia's own claim that all drones were destroyed, the uncomfortable questions remain. Interception isn't free, readiness isn't free, and narratives aren't free. Each wave forces a calculation. How long can defenses maintain performance? How long can crews stay sharp? How long can the state keep people calm? And how many nights of disruption does it take before the public starts quietly doubting competence? Here are the two engagement questions I want you to think about as you listen to this unfold. Do you think the bigger impact of these Moscow drone swarms is physical damage, or the psychological effect of airport shutdowns, internet disruptions, and the sense that the capital is no longer untouchable? And if Ukraine keeps splitting its pressure between Moscow's symbolism and Krasnodar's oil logistics, which target do you believe will force the Kremlin into harder decisions first? Fear in the capital or fuel problems near the front? Because that's the real contest here. Not only drones versus air defenses, but pressure versus denial. The attacker tries to create visible consequences. The defender tries to compress reality into a controlled script. And when the defender starts shutting down platforms, restricting communication, and scrambling to keep daily life functioning, you're seeing strain, whether officials admit it or not. At the same time, it's important not to romanticize any of this. Drone warfare is loud, disruptive, and frightening for civilians on all sides. It spreads uncertainty, it hardens attitudes, and it creates feedback loops where each side escalates to regain initiative. But from a strategic perspective, Ukraine's message appears to be that distance will not be a shield for leadership decisions, and that the economic systems enabling the war, fuel, logistics, movement will be targeted again and again. And the story may be heading toward yet another escalation. Reports suggest the U.S. is completing testing on a weapon described as the Rusty Dagger, which could expand Ukraine's ability to strike deep targets. Whether that system appears soon, later, or in a different form, the broader pattern is clear. Long-range capabilities are becoming central to how this war is fought, not as a sideshow, but as a pillar of strategy. So here's where we leave it for now. Moscow is being tested by scale and persistence. Krasnodar Krai is burning at critical nodes. Russia is tightening information controls when it most needs citizens to believe everything is fine. And Ukraine is signaling that it can apply pressure in more than one way at the same time, by targeting what feeds the war and by challenging the myth that the capital will always be protected. This is Jonathan Blake, and if you want more narration like this, tight, detailed, and focused on what these events actually mean, make sure you're subscribed and keep the conversation going in the comments.